The Pacific Northwest does not merely rain, it weeps. As Jessica stood before the skeletal remains of the Blackwood State Hospital, the cold Oregon drizzle seeped through her waterproof jacket, chilling her to the bone. This wasn't just another abandoned building for her urban decay portfolio. Blackwood was a monolith of architectural suffering, a Gothic nightmare of red brick and rusted iron bars nestled deep within the suffocating grip of the Siuslaw National Forest. The institution had been shuttered in 1974 following a series of unexplained disappearances, leaving behind a legacy of whispered horrors and litigation that lasted decades. Jessica gripped her Canon camera tightly, the strap cutting into her palm. She needed this. Her career was stalling, and the rumors of the Dark Room, a specialized photography lab used by the asylum's last head of medicine, Dr. Aristone, were too tantalizing to ignore. The front doors, heavy oak reinforced with iron, stood slightly ajar, as if the building itself were exhaling a stale, frozen breath. Jessica pushed them open, the hinges screaming in a high-pitched metallic wail that echoed too long in the cavernous lobby. Inside, the air was different. It was heavy, stagnant, and smelled of ozone and wet limestone. Her flashlight beam cut through the gloom, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny, frantic ghosts in the air. The lobby was a graveyard of bureaucratic debris, overturned filing cabinets, shattered glass from the receptionist's booth, and tattered remains of patient records that crinkled under her boots like dried skin. She began to walk, her footsteps the only sound in the oppressive silence. "Focus, Jess," she whispered to herself, but her voice sounded thin and alien. She followed the peeling wallpaper of the main corridor, heading toward the south wing, where the basement stairs were located. The walls were covered in a sickly institutional green paint that was bubbling and sloughing off in long, necrotic strips. As she moved deeper, the temperature plummeted. Her breath hitched, forming small clouds of vapor that seemed to linger longer than they should. She reached the stairwell. The door was heavy steel, the words radiology and photography, basement, barely legible through the rust. Descending into the basement felt like entering a different dimension. The light from her torch seemed to be swallowed by the darkness, the beam struggling to penetrate more than a few feet ahead. The silence here was louder, a buzzing, static hum that vibrated in her teeth. She found it at the end of a long, dripping hallway, a door painted entirely in matte black. Unlike the others, it had no window. A small brass plaque read, "The Dark Room, authorized personnel only." Jessica pushed the door open. The smell hit her instantly, the sharp, acidic sting of glacial acetic acid and silver nitrate. It was impossible. The facility had been abandoned for half a century, yet the chemicals smelled fresh, as if a tray had just been poured. She stepped inside, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The room was bathed in a dim, pulsing red light. Her brain struggled to process it. There was no power in this building, no generators hummed, yet the safety lamp on the ceiling glowed with a rhythmic, crimson heartbeat. In the center of the room, several rectangular trays sat on a wooden benchwork. They were filled with clear liquid that rippled slightly despite the lack of vibration. Above, rows of photographs were clipped to a drying wire. Jessica approached them, her camera forgotten around her neck. She shone her light on the first photo. It was a shot of the hospital exterior. The second was of the lobby. The third was the stairwell. Her blood turned to ice. The photos were wet. They were still developing. She looked at the fourth photo. It was a shot of her own back, taken from the perspective of the hallway she had just walked through. She was standing at the dark room door. The image was so clear she could see the stray hairs escaping her ponytail. Suddenly, the red light flickered and intensified, turning the room into the color of fresh arterial spray. Behind her, the sound of a wet, rhythmic splashing began. It came from the furthest tray, the one she hadn't checked yet. Something was rising from the chemical bath. It sounded like a heavy cloth being dragged through water, followed by the soft, sickening thud of bare, wet feet on the concrete floor. Jessica froze. She didn't want to turn around. She wanted to scream, but her throat was a desert. The smell of the chemicals was being replaced by something else, the smell of old bandages and stagnant blood. A shadow stretched across the workbench, elongated and distorted, cast by the crimson lamp. It was a human shape, but the limbs were too long, the joints bending at angles that defied anatomy. "Is someone there?" she managed to choke out. The splashing stopped. The only sound was the drip, drip, drip of liquid falling from something onto the floor. Then, a voice, or a mockery of one, rasped from the darkness behind her. It didn't sound like it came from vocal cords. It sounded like the grinding of dry bones. "The exposure is not finished." Jessica spun around, her flashlight beam swinging wildly. The light hit a figure standing in the corner. It was a man, or what remained of one, wearing a tattered lab coat that was stained a deep brownish black. His face was a mask of translucent, stretched skin, and where his eyes should have been, there were only two perfectly circular black voids, like camera lenses. He held a vintage Leica camera, but the device seemed to be fused to his hand, the metal growing into his flesh. He raised the camera. Jessica tried to run, but her feet felt like they were encased in lead. The red light flared with blinding intensity. The shutter clicked, like a bone snapping. In that split second of the flash, she saw the room filled with people, dozens of patients, their mouths sewn shut with silver wire, standing perfectly still, all staring at her. When the flash faded, they were gone, but the man in the lab coat remained, stepping closer. The wet slap of his feet echoed. He pointed toward the drying wire. Jessica's eyes followed his finger. A new photo had appeared on the line, though she hadn't seen him move to put it there. She stepped toward it, compelled by a horrific curiosity. The photo was of her, but not like the others. In this one, she was screaming, her face contorted in agony, and her eyes were missing, replaced by the same circular black voids as the man's. "No," she whimpered, backing away until she hit the cold, damp wall. The man smiled, a jagged tear in his parchment skin. "We need a new perspective." He lunged with impossible speed. Jessica dove to the side, her shoulder slamming into the workbench, knocking the trays of chemicals onto the floor. The acid hissed as it ate into the concrete, releasing a thick, choking cloud of vapor. She scrambled toward the door, her hands slipping on the wet floor. She could hear him behind her, the clicking of the camera shutter accelerating, faster and faster, sounding like a machine gun. She burst through the door into the hallway, her lungs burning. She didn't look back. She ran through the darkness, her flashlight beam dancing erratically over the peeling walls. But the hallway felt longer now. The door she had passed seemed to be multiplying. Every time she passed a door, she heard a click, click, click. She reached the stairs and flew up them, her heart ready to explode. She burst into the lobby, but the exit was gone. Where the massive oak doors had been, there was now only a solid brick wall, the mortar looking centuries old. She was trapped. She turned around, her back to the wall, gasping for air. The lobby was silent again, but the silence was different now. It was expectant. She looked down at her own camera, the one hanging around her neck. The digital screen, which should have been off, flickered to life. It began to play back the photo she had just taken, but she hadn't pressed the shutter. The screen showed image after image of her running, her face pale with terror, and in every shot, just inches behind her, was the man in the lab coat, his long, spindly fingers reaching for her neck. Then the final photo appeared. It was a shot of her right now, leaning against the brick wall. Jessica looked up from the screen. In the center of the lobby, the red light from the basement began to bleed through the floorboards, staining the dust a horrific crimson. The man with the lens eyes stood there, his camera raised. "Smile," he rasped. The flash blinded her, and for a moment the entire world was white. When her vision returned, she wasn't in the lobby anymore. She was back in the dark room, standing over a tray of developer. She looked down at her hands. They were pale, stained with silver nitrate. She felt a weight around her neck. It wasn't her Canon. It was a heavy, metallic Leica, cold and smelling of the grave. The rusted iron gates of Blackwood State Hospital groaned, a sound that cut through the relentless Oregon drizzle like a dying man's last rattling breath. Jessica stood in the rotunda, her flashlight cutting a fragile yellow swath through a decade of accumulated dust and decay. The air inside didn't just feel cold, it felt heavy, pressurized, as if the very oxygen had been replaced by the weight of forgotten agonies. To her left, a row of shattered windows allowed the moonlight to filter through, casting jagged silver blades across the linoleum floor. Every step she took echoed with a hollow, booming finality, the sound of her hiking boots crunching over pulverized glass and discarded patient files. This was the place where the state of Oregon had hidden its unfixables, the violent, the catatonic, and those who claimed to see things that shouldn't exist. Now, the hospital itself had become one of those things. She moved deeper into the north wing, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The walls were weeping. It wasn't just the rain leaking through the crumbling ceiling. A dark, viscous moisture seeped from the peeling wallpaper, forming Rorschach patterns that seemed to shift whenever she blinked. The dark room, that was her destination. It wasn't on any official map she'd found in the county archives, but the local legends were persistent. They spoke of a sub-basement chamber where Dr. Aris Thorne practiced sensory nullification therapy. In reality, it was a place where light was forbidden, a vacuum designed to break the human spirit. Her sister, Sarah, had been obsessed with this place before she vanished, her last journal entry a frantic scribble about the shadow that breathes in the dark. As Jessica reached the threshold of Ward C, the atmosphere shifted, the temperature plummeted, and the smell of ozone and wet copper, blood, filled her nostrils. Her flashlight flickered, the beam narrowing as if the darkness itself were hungry, gnawing at the edges of the light. She reached out to touch the heavy, reinforced steel door of the isolation wing. It was ice cold, vibrating with a low-frequency hum that she felt in her teeth. Pushing it open, the hinges screamed, a high-pitched metallic wail that sounded disturbingly like a human shriek. The corridor beyond was a tunnel of absolute obsidian. Her light struggled to penetrate more than 3 feet ahead. Here, the silence was different. It wasn't the absence of sound, it was a physical presence, a thick, suffocating velvet that pressed against her ears until they pulsed with pain. She found herself in front of a heavy oak door, marked only with a faded brass 0, the dark room. Jessica hesitated, her hand trembling as she gripped the handle. She remembered the stories, how patients would be locked in here for weeks, emerging with their eyes turned milky white, speaking in tongues that sounded like the wind through dead leaves. She turned the knob. It gave way with a sickeningly smooth click. Inside, the room was a perfect cube of shadow. Even her high-intensity LED light seemed to die at the doorway, the beam absorbed by the matte black walls that absorbed all reflection. She stepped inside, the door swinging shut behind her with a soft, final thud. Panic flared in her chest as she realized the lock had engaged. She spun around, pounding on the door, but the wood felt soft, almost like flesh, absorbing her blows without a sound. Then the flickering light finally died. Total, absolute darkness. In that void, her other senses sharpened to a terrifying degree. She heard it then, a soft, rhythmic scratching, like long nungnails dragging across the floor. It wasn't coming from the corners of the room, it was coming from right beneath her feet. And then a whisper, so close it brushed her neck, spoken in a voice that sounded exactly like her missing sister. "Jessica, did you bring the light, or did you come to join the dark?" The air grew thick with the smell of old formaldehyde, and as she reached out in the blackness, her fingers didn't meet a wall. They met something cold, wet, and blinking. The heavy iron door behind Jessica clicked shut with a finality that seemed to suck the very oxygen out of the corridor. The silence of Blackwood State Hospital was not a void, it was a physical weight, a suffocating presence that pressed against her eardrums. Outside, the Oregon rain continued its relentless assault on the roof, but inside, the air was stagnant, smelling of floor wax, copper, and the unmistakable, cloying scent of long-settled dust. Her flashlight's beam cut through the gloom, a lonely spear of white light that revealed the skeletal remains of the lobby. To her left, the admitting desk was a splintered carcass of mahogany covered in a thick carpet of mold that looked like gray fur. She took a breath, the cold air stinging her lungs, and adjusted her grip on the camera bag slung over her shoulder. Every step she took on the checkered linoleum floor echoed, the sound bouncing off the high, cracked ceilings and disappearing into the black maws of the branching hallways. She was searching for the development wing, a part of the hospital rumored to have housed the most experimental psychiatric treatments of the late 1950s. Her research pointed towards a specific dark room, not merely for photography, but a place where patients were subjected to sensory deprivation in total darkness to realign the psyche. Her sister, Sarah, had been obsessed with this place before she vanished, her last journal entry a frantic scribble about the shadow that breathes in the dark. As Jessica reached the threshold of Ward C, the atmosphere shifted. The temperature plummeted, and the smell of ozone and wet copper, blood, filled her nostrils. Her flashlight flickered, the beam narrowing as if the darkness itself were hungry, gnawing at the edges of the light. She reached out to touch the heavy, reinforced steel door of the isolation wing. It was ice cold, vibrating with a low-frequency hum that she felt in her teeth. Pushing it open, the hinges screamed, a high-pitched metallic wail that sounded disturbingly like a human shriek. The corridor beyond was a tunnel of absolute obsidian. Her light struggled to penetrate more than 3 feet ahead. Here, the silence was different. It wasn't the absence of sound, it was a physical presence, a thick, suffocating velvet that pressed against her ears until they pulsed with pain. She found herself in front of a heavy oak door marked only with the faded brass 0, the dark room. Jessica hesitated, her hand trembling as she gripped the handle. She remembered the stories, how patients would be locked in here for weeks, emerging with their eyes turned milky white, speaking in tongues that sounded like the wind through dead leaves. She turned the knob. It gave way with a sickeningly smooth click. Inside, the room was a perfect cube of shadow. Even her high-intensity LED light seemed to die at the doorway, the beam absorbed by the matte black walls that absorbed all reflection. She stepped inside, the door swinging shut behind her with a soft, final thud. Panic flared in her chest as she realized the lock had engaged. She spun around, pounding on the door, but the wood felt soft, almost like flesh, absorbing her blows without a sound. Then the flickering light finally died. Total, absolute darkness. In that void, her other senses sharpened to a terrifying degree. She heard it then, a soft, rhythmic scratching, like long nails dragging across the floor. It wasn't coming from the corners of the room, it was coming from right beneath her feet. And then a whisper, so close it brushed her neck, spoken in a voice that sounded exactly like her missing sister. "Jessica, did you bring the light, or did you come to join the dark?" The air grew thick with the smell of old formaldehyde, and as she reached out in the blackness, her fingers didn't meet a wall, they met something cold, wet, and blinking. The heavy iron door behind Jessica clicked shut with a finality that seemed to suck the very oxygen out of the corridor. The silence of Blackwood State Hospital was not a void, it was a physical weight, a suffocating presence that pressed against her eardrums. Outside, the Oregon rain continued its rhythmic assault on the roof, but inside, the air was stagnant, smelling of floor wax, copper, and the unmistakable cloying scent of long-settled dust. Her flashlight's beam cut through the gloom, a lonely spear of white light that revealed the skeletal remains of the lobby. To her left, the admitting desk was a splintered carcass of mahogany covered in a thick carpet of mold that looked like gray fur. Jessica took a breath, the cold air stinging her lungs, and adjusted her grip on the camera bag slung over her shoulder. Every step she took on the checkered linoleum floor echoed, the sound bouncing off the high, cracked ceilings and disappearing into the black maws of the branching hallways. She was searching for the development wing, a part of the hospital rumored to have housed the most experimental psychiatric treatments of the late 1950s. Her research had pointed toward a specific dark room, not merely for photography, but a place where patients were subjected to sensory deprivation in total darkness to realign the psyche. As she moved deeper into the administration wing, the walls began to tell stories of neglect. Paint peeled in long, jagged strips like dead skin. On a notice board, a yellowed memo dated October 1964 fluttered in a draft that shouldn't have existed. It was signed by a Dr. Eris Thorne. Jessica paused, her light lingering on the signature. Thorne had been the chief of staff during the infamous Blackwood Blackout, an event shrouded in redacted files and local hushed whispers. The floorboards beneath her feet groaned, a low, guttural protest that made her freeze. In the distance, a metallic clatter, the sound of a tray hitting the floor, shattered the stillness. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. "Is anyone there?" she whispered, her voice sounding small and fragile against the vast emptiness. No answer came, but the air grew colder, a localized drop in temperature that turned her breath into a ghostly mist. She followed the source of the sound, her boots crunching on broken glass and discarded medical charts. She reached a set of double doors marked with a tarnished brass plaque, Radiology and Imaging. Beneath it, a hand-lettered sign on cardboard had been taped, "Dark Room, do not enter without clearance." The tape was brittle, the cardboard warped by decades of moisture. Jessica pushed against the doors. They resisted at first, the hinges screaming in a high-pitched register that set her teeth on edge, then finally gave way with a shuddering jolt. Inside, the darkness was absolute. It was a darkness that felt liquid, pooling around her ankles and rising to meet her waist. Her flashlight struggled here. The beam seemed shorter, muffled by the sheer density of the shadows. The room smelled of silver nitrate and vinegar, the sharp, acidic tang of developing fluid. As she panned her light around, she saw rows of stainless steel sinks, their basins stained with dark, concentric rings. Hanging from wires stretched across the room were dozens of photographic negatives. They swayed gently, though the air was now deathly still. Jessica stepped closer, her curiosity momentarily overriding her dread. She shone her light through one of the negatives. It wasn't a brain scan or an X-ray. It was a silhouette of a person, or something shaped like a person, standing in the middle of a hallway that looked remarkably like the one she had just traversed. In the next frame, the figure was closer. In the third, its face filled the frame, a blurred mask of agony with hollowed-out pits where eyes should have been. Suddenly, the red "in-use" light above the inner door flickered to life. It didn't make sense. The building had been decommissioned and disconnected from the power grid for 30 years. The red glow was sickly, casting long, distorted shadows that danced across the walls. A low hum began to vibrate through the floor, a mechanical thrumming that felt like a heartbeat. Jessica backed away, her pulse racing. She tripped over a discarded canister, the metal clanging loudly. When she looked up, the negatives hanging from the wires were no longer swaying. They were pointing at her. Every single translucent strip of film was angled toward her position, as if tracked by an invisible force. Then, the liquid in the sinks began to churn. A black, oily substance bubbled over the edges, spilling onto the floor and creeping toward her boots. She tried to turn back to the double doors, but they were no longer there. In their place was only the seamless, peeling wall of the darkroom. She was trapped in the developing tank of Blackwood's history, and the image was finally starting to clear. The finality of the iron door's click was not merely a mechanical engagement of a lock, it was the sound of a tomb sealing. Jessica stood paralyzed in the sudden, suffocating vacuum of the hallway. The silence in Blackwood State Hospital was a physical weight, a thick, gelatinous pressure that pressed against her eardrums until they throbbed with the ghost of a sound. She didn't move, she didn't breathe. Her heart, however, was a frantic bird battering its wings against the cage of her ribs. The flashlight in her trembling hand threw a frantic, jittering beam across the peeling walls. Here, the lead-based paint didn't just flake, it curled like burnt skin, revealing the gray, necrotic concrete beneath. "Focus," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp that felt too loud in the oppressive stillness. But Blackwood was a fortress designed to keep things in, not let them out. She began to walk, her boots crunching on the shattered glass of medicine vials and the skeletal remains of light fixtures. Every step echoed, but the echo was wrong. It arrived a fraction of a second too late, as if someone else was walking behind her, mimicking her stride with predatory precision. She stopped. The echo didn't. It took one more heavy, dragging step before silence reclaimed the corridor. Jessica didn't look back. She knew that looking back was an invitation. She turned a corner and the air changed. The smell of damp origin earth and rotting pine was replaced by something sharp, acidic, and chemical. It was the scent of a dark room, the pungent odor of silver nitrate and developing fluid. Ahead, a heavy wooden door stood slightly ajar, its surface charred by some long-ago fire that had failed to consume the building. Above the frame, a cracked red bulb hung like a dead eye. This was the radiology and clinical photography wing, a place where the madness of the patients was once captured on silver plates to be studied under the cold gaze of Victorian-era eugenicists. As she pushed the door open, the hinges screamed, a high-pitched metallic wail that sounded like a human throat being torn open. Inside, the dark room was a labyrinth of black curtains and stainless steel sinks. The darkness here was different. It was absolute, a Stygian ink that the beam of her flashlight struggled to pierce. She panned the light around the counters. Dozens of glass plates sat in drying racks coated in dust but miraculously unbroken. Jessica approached the first rack, her curiosity momentarily overriding her terror. She wiped the dust from a plate and held it up to her light. It was a portrait of a woman. Her eyes were wide, the pupils dilated to total blackness. But it wasn't the woman that chilled Jessica to her marrow, it was the shadow behind her. In the photograph, the shadow had fingers that were far too long, tapering into needle-like points that seemed to be stitching themselves into the woman's scalp. Jessica dropped the plate. It shattered on the floor, the sound exploding like a gunshot. "It's just an artifact," she lied to herself, "a double exposure, a trick of the chemicals." But then she noticed the sinks. They were full. The developing fluid, which should have evaporated decades ago, sat black and stagnant in the basins. As she watched, a bubble rose to the surface of the nearest sink and popped, releasing a foul metallic stench. Then another. The liquid began to churn, a slow, rhythmic pulsing, as if something deep within the plumbing was breathing. Suddenly, the red bulb above the door flickered to life. It didn't make a warm glow. It bathed the room in a visceral, bloody crimson. The shadows in the room elongated, stretching across the floor like spilled ink. Jessica backed away, her heels hitting a row of hanging negatives. They brushed against her face like cold, wet tongues. She flailed, trying to bat them away, but the film strips were sticky, coated in a residue that smelled of copper and old meat. On the far wall, a large projection screen began to glow. There was no projector, no power source, yet an image began to form. It was a grainy, flickering film of this very room. In the film, a man sat in a chair, his head encased in a metal frame. A photographer, obscured by a black shroud, adjusted a massive bellows-style camera. The man in the chair began to scream, a silent, cinematic agony. As the photographer pulled the lever, the man's face didn't just light up from the flash, it began to dissolve, the skin running like hot wax, being sucked into the lens of the camera. Jessica tried to scream, but her throat was constricted by the thickening air. The man in the film turned his head. He wasn't looking at the photographer anymore, he was looking at her. His eyeless sockets were twin voids of absolute nothingness. He raised a hand, his fingers elongating, mirroring the needle-like points she had seen on the glass plate. He reached toward the edge of the frame, and his hand, solid, gray, and dripping with black fluid, emerged from the screen and into the room. Panicked, Jessica scrambled backward, her flashlight falling and rolling under a heavy metal table. The red light intensified, pulsing with the beat of a dying heart. The black liquid in the sinks began to overflow, cascading onto the floor in a viscous wave that crawled toward her boots. The shadows of the hanging negatives began to detach themselves from the film strips, dancing on the walls like skeletal marionettes. "You aren't real!" she shrieked, her voice breaking. In response, the whispering started. It wasn't one voice, but hundreds, a cacophony of hushed, wet stammers emanating from the walls themselves. They spoke in a dialect of pain, a language of lost identities. "Develop us," they hissed. "Give us your light." Jessica reached the door, but it wouldn't budge. The wood felt soft now, like flesh, and the doorknob was warm, pulsing with a low, sickening heat. She turned back to the room. The figure from the screen was halfway out, its torso pulling itself through the silver fabric with a sickening, wet tearing sound. The shadows were closing in, the red light was blinding, and the smell of the dark room was now the smell of an open grave in the height of an Oregon summer. She was no longer just a witness, she was the next subject, the next soul to be etched into the silver nitrate of Blackwood's eternal, agonizing memory.